Thank you, Chair. Peace be upon you. I'd like to begin by expressing my appreciation to INSAP for this very kind invitation. What I'd like to do this afternoon is to first focus on what I think is the fundamental problem with the economy and with societal development in Malaysia. And then I'd like to propose some very broad solutions to that fundamental challenge. Listening to all the presentations and reading a little bit about the 12th Malaysia Plan, I'm convinced that after 63 years and numerous development plans, we have yet to overcome the challenge of disparities in our society. That is our major challenge. Disparities in geographical and spatial terms, disparities in terms of socioeconomic status, income, disparities in terms of gender, disparities in terms of abilities, opportunities. It is basically the challenge of disparities. Now, what is good about our shared vision articulated a couple of years ago is that it appears to be concerned about disparities. But what I was a little disappointed about the shared vision theory contained in what our planners had articulated in terms of concrete details on how we are going to overcome disparities, we seem to have fallen short of the mark. How we are really going to overcome these disparities, because one gets the impression, and correct me if I'm wrong, one gets the impression that we don't want to deal with the type of structural issues related to disparities that affect elite interests. And this actually is a problem everywhere. Elite interests have become so entrenched in so many different types of societies and systems. They become so entrenched that bringing about real, meaningful, fundamental change is almost impossible because of the way in which these interests have become entrenched over time. And we are not an exception. Before I go into that, friends, let me say that Malaysia has, on a comparative basis, done better than a number of other countries. We cannot run away from this truth. We have done better because in certain areas we have performed well. Again, it is a relative judgment. We have performed quite well. If you look at even this question of poverty and disparities and so on, let us not forget that we started off at the time of Merdeka in 1957 with a very well thought out rural development program that is related to both income disparities in a sense, but also to geographical and spatial disparities. A massive rural development program that centered around schools, health clinics, infrastructure, roads, bridges, and all the rest of it. It was quite a remarkable program. It had its shortcomings. It failed in certain respects, but nonetheless, it was one of our achievements. One of the reasons why we had a fairly good foundation. And it's also true that if you look at another dimension of societal development, this goes beyond economics. We did the right thing. We did the right thing by adopting an inclusive approach to our citizenry, by which I mean the granting of citizenship to a very big proportion of the people, the populace, which had become part of the country as a result of various historical and sociological forces. It was not an easy decision. It was fraught with tremendous challenges and political risks, but it was done. And that sort of inclusive approach in terms of citizenry also helped, because it helped in preserving a very big segment of the economy. It gave rights and a role to the newer citizens in a situation where you find that the whole question was hotly debated at a certain point, but in the end, the elite prevailed, and this is what was done. So inclusivity in terms of politics and participation was also a positive factor. And to that, I think one should add an attitude which has been there all along amongst our people, and this is to the credit of the Malaysian people as a whole, a live and let live attitude, where we are able to accept differences. You don't have to articulate this in charters and programs and so on, but it is there. It is in the way in which people live in Malaysia. We accept differences. We are generally quite an accommodative people, and we understand the need to give and take. And these have been our strengths. And to this, I would add, as I always do whenever I talk about what I see as the strengths of this society, before one talks about shortcomings, we have had, and this again is a stroke of good fortune, we have had a workable constitution. It's a remarkable constitution in many ways. If you really reflect on it, the Malaysian constitution. And you don't get this from people who are just interested in articles and clauses of the constitution. You have to see it in terms of the larger context of the constitution, its dynamic, and you understand why this is such a remarkable document that we have. It takes into account the history and background of the country and the realities that have shaped the nation over a period of time. It takes into account the identities of individual communities. It takes into account rights. And there is an implicit recognition of responsibilities, which I'll talk about later. But the point I'm making is that we've had this strength, we have had this blessing. It is nothing less than a blessing, our natural resources. And we are sheltered from some of the major challenges that other societies, our neighbors, are confronted with. And by this I mean typhoons and floods, massive type of floods, which some of our neighbors have had to face, and also earthquakes and natural disasters of that sort. We've been a very fortunate country, a lucky land, as it were. What has gone wrong? Why is it that we have this challenge of disparities? Let me put it in simple, stark terms. It is because of our socioeconomic system, It is because of the underlying ideology. It is because of something that we don't really talk about in this country. It is basically the capitalist system that is the root problem. An elite-oriented capitalist system. Most of the time, that's what capitalism is. It's elite-oriented, where the fruits of development are basically enjoyed to a greater extent by people who are in the upper echelons of society. I'm not saying it's just the elites, but people who are in the upper echelons. They enjoy the fruits of development. And this has been so in our society, friends, for such a long while, for decades. That is our problem. We continue to operate that sort of system. We feel that it's the only system that we can have. We dare not think of alternatives, and there are, I think, alternatives that one can work on, but we haven't really bothered about this. We are somehow convinced that this is the only way in which we can manage society. A sort of elite-oriented, capitalist-oriented economic system with all its social and political implications. This is the root problem, and we have to recognize this. Which is why, if you look at things that have happened over the years, and I'll give just a couple of examples to reinforce this point, even something like the Rural Development Program that I alluded to earlier, which was praiseworthy in terms of overcoming disparities and all the rest of it. There were times when certain things could not be done. Why? Because there were vested interests. And what were these vested interests? These were vested interests linked to capital and to the power generated by capital. So an attempt to, say, organize cooperatives in the rural sector in the early years of independence, it just didn't take off because of the opposition from those with vested interests. And because that had to be taken into account in terms of elections and seats and all the rest of it, a lot of ordinary people suffered. The poor suffered. And you can look at another sector that emerged a few years after independence. This was the manufacturing sector. And in terms of organizing workers and ensuring that workers had their rights and strengthening their position, it was thwarted at every turn and corner. Again, because of vested interests, because of those with capital, with wealth, those who had power, they made sure that that wouldn't happen. So you had your factories, you had workers, you provided them with some jobs, but that was it. One couldn't go beyond a certain limit. Why? Because of the power of capital, because of the system that we operated. And this is the reality. This is something that we cannot run away from when we talk about our situation. I don't see how the 12th Malaysia Plan will deal with this, because the 12th Malaysia Plan, if it's going to propose fundamental changes, it must be prepared to at least offer some solutions to challenges of this sort. The type of socioeconomic system we've inherited, what it means in terms of ordinary people, their interests, their well-being. The question what one should ask now is, what is the solution? How do we overcome this? Given the time constraint, I just want to propose 3 quick solutions. Number 1, focus upon the question of disparities. When you talk of shared prosperity, it has got no meaning if you don't focus upon disparities and be concrete in dealing with these disparities. Look at our brothers and sisters from Sabah and the presentations from Sabah and Sarawak. And I've come across presentations of this sort on numerous occasions. It is just amazing when you think about it, how wide the gap is between some of those parts of our land, our common land, Sabah and Sarawak, and the rest of Malaysian society, more affluent parts of Malaysia. Now, one has to focus upon these challenges in a concrete manner, not in general terms. Socioeconomic, sociogeographic disparities of the sort. Look at income disparities in the public services, for instance, how huge the gap is, and why we are not prepared to touch on this at all. I mean, just like in the case of national budget and our need, the recognized need to improve the income situation of people in the lower echelons of society, we don't want to do certain things because we want to preserve those vested interests. We don't talk about substantial, real salary cuts. We don't talk about evaluating the whole system of salaries and allowances in this country, especially for those at the upper echelons. We don't discuss any of these things. And even people from the private sector who very often laud the private sector and talk about how great the private sector is and so on. Why don't we look at incomes, at remunerations within the private sector and compare to what people at the lower levels within the private sector, within certain companies and so on, earn every month? And this has come to the fore because of the COVID-19 crisis that confronts all of us. You can see how serious these disparities are. So we don't want to deal with this. So let us have a plan that focuses upon these disparities in concrete terms, in terms of allowances, salaries, in terms of the returns from labor, from people who are working hard, who are suffering. What are they getting in relation to what others are enjoying? Is this fair? Is it just? I think these are fundamental questions we have to ask. It is not an ethnic question at all. This is a question of socioeconomic disparities, of class, rather than ethnicity. And we must be prepared to face this. So this, to my mind, is the first challenge. All the various dimensions of disparities. Then our sister just now talked about gender disparities, which are also very, very serious, and we have to address them. And disparities, which you also alluded to, involving people with disabilities. A lot of lip service, but in terms of actual action, we have not been able to achieve very much. So concrete focus upon disparities, if you want to give any meaning at all to this shared prosperity vision. Number two, I think it is also very, very important for us to emphasize research. Others have alluded to this. I'm talking of scientific research, research that would tap into new sources of wealth, research which would draw upon, which would harness some of the hitherto untapped, some of the hitherto concealed sources of wealth in this country itself. The tremendous diversity that we have in terms of flora and fauna, especially in Sabah and Sarawak, and how we can harness this wealth, this knowledge for the benefit of people as a whole, not just a few individuals here and there. But basically that sort of orientation towards research is not there. Our universities are not doing it, our research institutes are not doing it, and you find that generally the government itself is not as supportive of research in this sense as it should be. You compare us to, say, South Korea at a certain time in their past and the amount of attention South Korea gave to research and development, which is why, as some of you here would be aware of, when they decided to manufacture a car. They came into the scene later than us, but they did so much better because the engineering, the scientific base was so much stronger. It's not just the population factor. They were in a much better position because they had the foundation. And this is what we lack. Building a strong foundation as far as research is concerned. And that is the key to economic development, is science, mastering science. And here we're not just talking about the application of science, which is technology. We're talking about the basic sciences, which we have to harness to our advantage on our own and working with other people. We have not really paid much attention to that. I don't see much emphasis on that in the budget, for instance, or in our development programs in the past. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, the third area that we should emphasize. This goes back to the question of ethnicity, community, and interests, competing interests, and the rest of it. It's a huge subject and it's very, very complex. But all that I want to touch upon here is sort of a simplified solution to this challenge, which nonetheless one hopes will have to generate discussion. I think one of the problems with our country is that in approaching the question of ethnicity, we have been enamored with the rights approach. It's each community talking of its rights. And this applies to all communities. It's basically this obsession with the rights. Understandable. Rights are important. Rights must be incorporated into any formula to overcome all that, one agrees. But I think there's something more important than rights. And that thing that is more important should be wedded to rights. And that is a notion of responsibility. Responsibilities are equally important. And now more than ever before, we can see why responsibilities are so critical. You want to protect the environment, it's a question of responsibility. You want to overcome issues of gender, responsibility. If you want to talk about family, responsibility. These are very, very important factors. If you want to talk about overcoming disparities in society, socioeconomic disparities, responsibility is very important. What our society lacks, and many other societies are in the same category, it is a commitment to overcoming the wrongdoings through responsibility. A notion of responsibility, of one's stewardship, one's commitment to other human beings. And that goes for all sectors of society. I think it's the responsibility that we should emphasize. And I hope to see some emphasis upon responsibility as a shared principle, as a shared value that all Malaysians can subscribe to. And if you look into all our cultures and philosophies, responsibility is very important. Responsibility is in some ways more important than rights.
Right, thank you very much.
If I could, if you don't mind, brother, when the UN Declaration of Human Rights was being drafted, the representative from China argued for a clear articulation of responsibilities, not just a document that talked about rights, because he said that you cannot have a harmonious society or a just society without responsibility.